All right, welcome everyone to the inaugural event. This is a professional development event that was developed by the Black Biomechanists Association as well as the ASB Postdoc group, and we are really excited to have some wonderful panelists join us for this first event, learning how lab funding works. Right, so I'll introduce myself, our ISB postdoc moderators, and then the panelists. So my name is Kayla Seymour. I am a postdoc at the University of Southern California. I am the co-founder and also president of Black Biomechanists Association, and I also do program planning. And so this is a wonderful event that we've got to do. And I'll go with Danny first.
Hi, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces. I'm Danny Davis. I am wrapping up my second year, wrapping up my second year as a postdoc at the University of Utah.
Nice. And Riddhi?
Hi everyone, I'm Riddhi. I am also wrapping up the second year of my postdoc. I'm one of the co-organizers of the Postdoc Affinity group, along with Danny, and I'm at Northwestern.
Awesome. And then, like I said, we have amazing panelists. So I'm just going to go in order of where it is on my screen. We have Dr. Kate Saul, sorry.
That's all right. Hey, I'm Kate Saul. I'm at NC State now in mechanical and aerospace engineering, and I was previously at Wake Forest School of Medicine. So just for context of answers later, I have some medical school context I can provide.
Great. And we have Dr. Jason Franz.
Morning, good afternoon now for many of us. I'm Jason Franz. I'm a professor of rehabilitation engineering and applied biomechanics in our Lampe Joint Department of Biomedical Engineering at UNC Chapel Hill and NC State University.
Great. Dr. Chris Haas.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Haas. I'm a professor in the Department of Applied Physiology and Kinesiology and faculty in our Fixell Institute for Neurologic Diseases. And my day job is I'm in the provost office, so I oversee most of academics at the University of Florida.
Awesome. And we have Dr. Brooke Odell.
Hi everyone, I'm Brooke Odell. I am an assistant professor at Hope College. It's an undergrad institution. So if any of you are thinking about being at a teaching institution or an undergrad institution, happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'm also going up for tenure in the fall. So I know we're focusing on lab funding, but if you have some questions about the tenure process, happy to answer those too.
Perfect. And last but not least, we have Dr. Carl Zellick.
Hey everyone, nice to join you. Carl Zellick. I'm an engineering professor at Vanderbilt University. I've been here for 10 years. I work on exoskeletons and prosthetics, wearable and assistive technologies, either to help people with disabilities or to try to help prevent injuries from happening. In this context of this session, can talk about kind of lab funding in traditional academic sense of research and development funding. I'm also involved in some technology translation and spin-off companies, so can talk a little bit about SBIR or other kind of translational funding as well, if that topic is of interest.
Perfect. All right, so we have some moderated questions that we're going to start off with, and then we will leave the last 30 minutes of this for audience Q&A. Feel free along the way, if you have a question while we're giving some moderate questions and answers, to drop that in the chat, and then we'll go through the list once we're done. If you feel like you want to unmute to ask your question, totally fine. So we'll start off with some vocab, which is really important, and a lot of the reason why we started doing events like these is that a lot of words get thrown out that people might not necessarily understand about funding, and we want to try to get some questions answered about what do these vocab terms mean. And so the first one that I'm going to ask is about startup funds. And I'm going to ask that to Kate. Can you talk about startup funds?
Sure. So startup funds are funds that you negotiate and get when you are applying for a job as part of the support that you will have to get your lab started. So typically, and it will the form of it may look different at different institutions, but typically you will receive startup funds if you have a research active institution where you're going to be starting up a lab. Often it is structured in a way that it is delivered incrementally over several years, often 3. And you might get, one bolus in year 1, and then in year 2, and then in year 3. That may come in the form of, an account with money that you can use to purchase equipment or materials and supplies that you need to get started, perhaps to alter space to meet the needs of your lab. Sometimes it may come more in an in-kind format. So, time on a scanner where, you get some number of hours instead of getting the cash to pay for that. And often student support for some number of students may be included in that startup, again, as dollars or as a unit of 1 student stipend, 2 student stipends for X number of years. Sometimes those stipends may come in the form of an RA or an RA/TA, or that may also vary according to the institution and how they deliver that. If you are in a position where you're negotiating funds, it's wise to talk to others who have been through it, because there are probably things that you may forget to include, like software licenses or other items that it's just useful to talk to others, not just in your peer group, but also at the specific institution, because some institutions may automatically have lots of licenses for things that you don't need to pay for, and others might not, or have a culture of shared equipment while others have a culture of individual labs. It's also really important to understand that timing of it, to know if it's a use it or lose it. Sometimes money has to be spent out in year 1, and then you get year 2, and you'd have to make an active request to carry forward, and other places you're allowed to carry forward. So those are all kind of some items there that immediately pop to mind, and maybe others have comments they want to add.
Kate, that was fantastic. I just want to piggyback to emphasize that you think of startup as a package, right? We talk about funds, but you can't just ask somebody, how much was your startup funds? Because there may be student years of support. If you're moving into an empty room versus a room that has all your furniture, there are very different cost dynamics there. So think of it as a package, figure out what you need, and some of it will be real hard cash, and some of it will be other equipment, promises, commitments, or otherwise.
Yeah, I would just like to add maybe 2 points to the comment so far. So one, it's based really upon the current state of federal funding, and universities. It's not uncommon for universities to do as Kate said, which is offer you this package over 3 years, which means they don't actually have the money for the whole package to give it to you in 1 year. And so we're kind of leveraged out a couple years. And so with this change in indirect cost rates that are potentially coming, it'll be difficult for some institutions to honor those startup packages. And I think this has also led to some of the reasons why we might see some hiring freezes being announced at institutions nationwide. And so as you move forward if you're in the hiring cycle this year, I would say to try to get as much money up front and try to get it all into your account as early as possible.
Yeah, and I would say to be really strategic about the order in which you purchase or acquire things, to make sure you're getting the most important things up front, even in, not the current state of things. There are times where, people have had startups that they were asked to restrict spending on, they were asked to carry forward things instead of requesting to carry forward because they didn't actually have the money at that moment for whatever financial circumstances.
And I'm going to come in just to add one point that I've been advising people that are joining our department. I always assume that you had to wait until you were setting foot on campus to start spending your startup package on major pieces of equipment, and you have to anticipate lead times on some of this being 6 months or more. And while that may be the case at some institutions, others may be able to front the funding for you. So you can make some of those larger purchases and set foot on campus with boxes to start opening.
Awesome. Thank you for your input, everyone. I love this. I don't have to keep directing people to answer questions. We're
And I
gonna
do see the quick question from Ryan in the chat about
yep.
strategy, and I would say strategy. I would say to really think hard about which equipment is most essential for you to be able to make progress, and be aggressive about getting that quickly and early. And then you'll have to look at your particular institution and their circumstances right now financially to kind of game whether you think you should be conservative. But I don't think anybody should anticipate being able to carry things forward in future years in general.
Yeah, and from a legal perspective, your startup, like, they will sweep your startup package if the coffers are empty and they would need to pay bills. So it's your money, but it's not really your money.
Even under normal funding climates, we always encourage do not be conservative with this funding. It's there to be spent. You should be strategic in the ways in which you're spending and what you're spending it on. But launch your lab. Don't sit on this money. You need to start being productive now.
Excellent. Okay, and then on this topic of like what funds can be or can't be spent by whom, let's go to the next vocab, and that's indirect versus direct funds. Maybe Dr. Haas, you can take this one.
I'll give it a stab. There's usually this is in reference to in the granting world, right? And so when we say that it's going to cost us $1,000 of a person's time through the project, that's a direct cost. But universities have negotiated with federal agencies in the recognition that for you to do the work, there's institutional resources that have been put in place that allow for those direct actions to take place. And so the common examples that you'll hear people say are like who pays to keep the lights on, and who pays to keep the floors clean, and who pays to keep IT services running to your offices and to your equipment. And so that's the institutions, and the institutions recoup some of those costs in the form of indirect costs. You also see them kind of described as F&A costs. And so in reference to what I mentioned before with the potential changes in the IDC rates, just in the different faculty in this panel and in this webinar, we have varying degrees of negotiated rates with the federal government with respect to the indirect cost. And so that can range in some places to as low as 20%. So if you say it's going to cost $10,000 to do something, the university is going to charge the government $12,000 to do it, right? At other places, the privates, depending upon the cost of living in the area, it might be higher. It might be up to double the price of doing the grant. So while you say it's going to cost this amount of time, this amount of resources to do this grant, the university charges the federal government twice that if you have a higher IDC rate. And so that money comes back to the institutions. So when the grant gets funded, the government provides the direct cost and the indirect cost back to the institution. The schedule of how those are released is different across institutions. A lot of time the institutions front it, then we get the money back later. And then depending upon the institution, and this is something you should pay attention to when you're negotiating, is that some institutions return some of those FE&A costs back to the individual PIs. So at Florida, I get 10% of the indirect cost back to me as the PI. Other institutions give none back. Other institutions may give more back to the individual PI as well as into the departments. And so it's a way for the universities to conduct the business of education and research. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
This is kind of an interesting time since this has been a hot topic. The folks on this call are probably more familiar with this indirect versus direct cost than we were when we got started. The one thing I wish I kind of knew when I started as a faculty member is in the early days, you live in direct costs only. When like the university gives you money, here's $50,000. That's $50,000 you can spend on your research. But as you transition to externally funded grants or sponsored projects, you really have to understand this distinction because you're asking for total costs from whoever's providing that money. And so the indirect costs, the easiest way to think about it is you don't have any control over those funds. There are some mechanisms where you might get a little bit of that back, but first order approximation is you have no control over those funds. That is facilities and that is administration. So that's kind of what I wish I knew is early on, you're living in direct funds, but don't get too comfortable because you have to understand the total costs of things and be able to make that transition, which typically you'll do over the first few years of your faculty career as you transition from using your startup to then hopefully primarily being externally funded.
And to Carl's point, I think that there's lots of nuances with respect to the funding agencies, right? And so you may see that you're applying for a $100,000 award, and you need to know, is that $100,000 total, or is that $100,000 and then indirect costs are on top of that? And if you don't know, it can bite you back later when you think that you actually have, let's say, $130,000, but it's actually 100, and then when the money comes, you're like, how do I cut 30% of what I proposed to do because I wasn't paying attention to the source of funds in that space. Another thing one last thing to add to this is that in institutions budgeting models, there's a type of budgeting model called RCM or hybrid RCM or incentive-based funding you'll see as you're applying to institutions. In those models, there's typically a tax that the central administration puts on expenditures that the colleges do. So at our institution, it's ranged from anywhere from 8 to 13% of a tax. So what that means is every grant expenditure has a 13% tax at worst case coming back to the institution. So our college actually won't allow me to apply for any grants that have less than a 13% IDC return because it would actually cost money. The colleges would have to subsidize that grant award for you to do the work. And so just have that kind of understanding that could be a possibility when you're looking at places. Sorry, Jason.
No, that's great. And this is one of the reasons why I think most of the panelists here are excited to be here because we're also learning things from one another. 2 points on indirects. I want to speak first, a really good point made by Carl. As you are a junior faculty early in your career, you may not be working directly with indirects, but please know you are benefiting from them greatly in terms of grants management, ethics, IRB, all of the things that you would benefit. The workshops on making your grants better, a lot of these are supported by indirects, and they're really valuable in addition to keeping the facilities running. And then another way that I wish I would have known this early, another place that indirect costs come up in conversation as a surprise and a potential red flag is with industry partnerships. When an industry partner comes to me and says, I really want to do research, I would love to support a staff person in your lab for the next year to do this work. And I say, here's how much that's going to cost. And then you say, but in addition to that, I need 52.5% more to do the work here. You want to make sure that those partners are knowledgeable about the institutional expectations of that partnership pretty early on.
And I was just going to add, just to elaborate on something Chris had said, that there are different, although there is a negotiated federal rate, not all funders are federal, right? So like an industry partner or especially a foundation partner or like an education type partner may have a different negotiated rate, or restrictions on what type of or whether they pay overhead. And so that brings up to Chris's point of like your institution may not allow you to apply for all sources of funds if they have that type of restriction on. You often have to get pre-approval to apply for something that has a lower than the negotiated rate. The other word that came up in this was expenditures, and you get the budget, but then you have to spend it, and often some institutions are looking at your annual expenditure rate, not what you've received in grants, but what you're actually spending, and that's part of your annual evaluation, is making those comparisons on expenditure.
And that's particularly true in engineering. But there's publications and journal publications on the average expenditures in most engineering departments. So if you move into an engineering college for your faculty position, just know that expenditures are the rule of the day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And I think that transitions us nicely to one of the next vocab words, of grant and external funding, right? And how that could be different at your institution based on your institutional or internal funding. And we've already talked about that a little bit, but if anybody feels like there's more to elaborate, like the distinction between having external grant funding versus an internal or institutional grant.
I'll just share a pet peeve, and for context, I oversee promotion and tenure at the university, and so I get to review 300 plus faculty dossiers each year. And your startup package is not an internal grant. Think about a grant as something that you compete for and compete against others for, or it's a very selective process. So just as a pet peeve, don't put your startup package on your CV as an internal grant. I think it doesn't make you look as good as you think you may be trying to make yourself look good. And then the other thing is that, to Jason's point, we have lots of institutions have taken the IDC returns and reinvested them in their faculty, and so there'll be internal grant competitions, with the hopes that you would turn those pilot projects into externally funded projects. And you should absolutely apply for those. It's a great way to get feedback on your work. It's also a great way for you to identify potential collaborators. So as these little projects that you propose internally get reviewed, they're going to send it to people within your university that have expertise, at least close enough expertise to be able to judge the scholarship. And that often opens doors for collaborations. And so definitely take advantage of any internal opportunities that your universities provide.
I want to jump in with an analogy and something that took me a few years to learn. Hopefully this kind of internal versus external is straightforward as an idea, but we all got into this because we wanted to do science or research or teaching, but you have to understand a bit about the business of running a lab and business of running a university. Not to extreme depths, but just recognize that universities, institutions are businesses. And when you start a lab, you are effectively a startup business within your university. Okay. So the university is investing in you. They're putting an investment in your lab in terms of money and equipment and space, right? But you're never going to impress them by saying, like, look at this money I got, because you got it from them, right? Like, they're a separate business. So it should be obvious to you that you shouldn't be pitching them on the money that they gave you, right? That's not selling them on anything. Now, they want you to take that investment and go do other great things, bring in more money, do impactful research. And one of the reasons this helps me is because if you understand their motivations for things like internal pilot grants, if you can request a little more money or a little more support because it's going to help you go and do something external, funding from a different source, you can get your institution behind you. You can convince them of things. But for me, this framework helped me understand how to pitch ideas, things that are reasonable to ask for, including sometimes you have to ask for reductions in indirect rate. Like, hey, this, I want to work with this industry partner. We're just getting started. This could lead to something big, but I can't charge them $50,000 for the first little project. Like, we got to do something smaller, and this has a chance to grow. But this kind of analogy helped me just recognize that's how you work. And then for me, my framework for indirects is, as a startup, as a lab within the university, I have accounting and administrative and human resources support that I need. Now, if I was a standalone startup, I could go hire a private firm to help me with HR, to help me with accounting. The university has consolidated that for you into core services, which kind of, whether you like it or not, that is who you go to. And like, you're paying an indirect rate, you're paying these overhead administrative costs because they're going to provide those services to you. So yeah, without getting into all like the nuance of accounting and everything else, this simple framework is kind of how I think about things. It helps me make high level decisions, particularly when I'm thinking about if there's something I want to ask from the university, or whether my interests and my goals align with their interests and their business goals.
And I'd also, just to jump on that, make sure you use those resources, right? If you have a question about grants, not all form of money coming into the university from an industry partner might be in the form of a grant. It might be in the form of a contract or a fee for service, or there might be other mechanisms that you're not aware of, that those experts in your university are there to provide you that insight and guidance so that you can, position yourself best with those partners. So, make sure you're using those services that you're paying an indirect rate for.
And I was going to come in and add, since we're talking about intramural versus extramural funding, there's a few obvious and a few less obvious reasons why those seed or pilot funds from your institution are beneficial. Obviously, as Dr. Haas said, you are securing those funds so that the return on investment is extramural funding to the university that comes with indirect costs. And as Chris also said, it helps you build collaborations. But what that also does, beyond those things and generating preliminary data in support of your hypotheses, is it adds a ton of credibility to your team. In those federal applications, you can actually point to the fact that your institution, in a competitive review, has identified this particular research project. It's been vetted by peers at the institution. We've received this. Our team has received this. Because of that, we've been meeting every other week. You can establish the credibility of the team so you can start boosting some of those elements in the scoring rubric on your external grants.
And I just wanted to piggyback on what everyone has said. So at my institution, it's a smaller institution. So typically for our internal awards, sometimes they look for collaborative projects. So I'm in the engineering department. We don't have like separate schools, like a school of engineering, school of business. We're in divisions. And so sometimes they look for you to do things with people either in different departments, or even better yet, divisions that are different than yours. Priority is also given to pre-tenure faculty. So I know that my colleagues who are tenured are usually strategic. Sometimes they'll try to collaborate with the newer faculty member so that there's a better, might be a better chance of them getting funded. So just like we're talking about being strategic with the external funding, you want to also be strategic with the internal funding. And also, I think we can only be funded maybe like 2 years in a row, and then there's like a little bit of a break before they fund us again. So just make sure, like again, internal funding is a great way to get yourself started, especially when you're new. Because it allows you to kind of, have a wider targets in terms of internal and external funding. But you just want to make sure that you know the rules with those so that you can be strategic.
Awesome, Brooke. Thanks for stepping in for the teaching colleges. We are actually going to move on to something that's related and talk about different types of institutions. Riddhi, do you want to take that away?
Yeah, perfect. So for our next question, we wanted to ask about how different the funding landscape is based on the institution you're at. For example, like public versus private institution, even just engineering school versus medical school, or like more research or teaching focused. So we're actually going to start with Brooke. If you could talk a little bit more about at a teaching university, like where is your lab funding coming from and how that is different from other universities.
I would just say the biggest difference in funding is the type of awards that I can apply for. So, for example, like in theory, I can apply for an R01, but being that we are an undergraduate only institution, some people are able to have postbacks. There's the occasional postdoc at our institution, but for the most part, we are working with undergraduates only. So we don't really have the capacity for an R01. So for the type of institution that I'm at, if you're looking at NIH funding, then we apply for an R15 mechanism. And then you have to be careful because only certain institutes within NIH will offer R15s. I was actually eligible to apply for an R03, and so that one is under review, thankfully. So we'll see what happens with that. But that's just something to note, the different types of institutions that you're at. It can affect the type of funding that you can go for. In terms of NSF, we can apply for like career awards, but there are also specific mechanisms for undergraduates. So like there's the REU program, there's also an RUI program, and that's more for undergraduate institutions. NSF also for those in the engineering spaces. NSF also has like a building research capacity program. Those are more for faculty that are at non-R1 institutions. So you really have to know the mechanisms that you can apply for. Like you don't want to apply for an R01 and you write the stellar proposal, but you don't really have the capacity to do the work that you propose to do. So we still get funding. I would say that our funding sources are usually smaller. We can still apply for federal funding, internal funding. There's also foundations. Sometimes we get money from donors that are interested in certain things or industries. So it is possible. It's usually just smaller pots. So I would say for me, being more at like an undergrad or a teaching institution, in theory, I'm 75% teaching, 25% research. You can get some of those bigger NSF awards and you can buy out your teaching time. So for me, I get like a course release each semester to do research, and that's whether I'm funded or not. But I would say for me, the bulk of my research happens in the summer. And so that's another thing that I wanted to mention with the funding. So the internal funding mechanisms that we have at my institutions are more for summer research. So even though if I have external funding, then I pay students to do research with me during the academic year so that they can push things forward because I don't have as much time because I'm teaching and grading and advising and all of that. But those internal funds are only for summer. So you really have to be strategic about how to be productive, which students to hire, all of that. So just one thing that I wanted to mention about the teaching institutions, and they're all a little bit different. There are some that you might be in more of a collaborative lab space. For us, research, doing mentored research with students is very important. So the university invests in that quite a bit. But even within teaching institutions, there's a range. Some of them, it's kind of like research is like the side thing that you do, and they may not give you as much startup or have as much funding internally available. So sometimes that lets you know like how that institution prioritizes research. Yeah, I'm at a private, it's a private Christian institution. So thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great overview. I guess next, maybe from Kate, were there large differences between medical versus engineering schools that you could expand on in terms of like what types of grants you're applying to?
There were huge differences and somewhat less in terms. So let me clarify that both institutions I'm thinking of were both Research One institutions. So there was a significant emphasis on research as a proportion of our job duties and expectations. Probably more research emphasis in medical school than teaching emphasis, at least in my particular situation where it was focused on graduate students, in the biomedical space. But the main difference was in the expectations around how you were paying yourself rather than the types of grants. Like really the only difference in the types of grants was that there's a huge emphasis on like an NSF Career Award in an engineering space and a huge emphasis on K awards from NIH in the medical space. And they really didn't seem to understand anything about the other one at the opposite institution. But, otherwise, the real difference is how you're paying yourself. And that's kind of back to the analogy that Carl had about, you're running your own little mini startup, you're also kind of paying yourself, right? And thinking about how you are covering your salary. And at a 9-month engineering type school, you're typically a 9-month employee and your 9-month salary is accounted for or covered by your teaching duties and your research duties in whatever proportion is the expectation at your school. And then in the summer, you are unpaid for that time unless you have another source of funds to cover those 3 months. Now, as like a practical matter, you can arrange your salary so it's stretched and paid out over 12 months. But the reality is you're not being paid for that time in the summer unless you have received funds from a grant or external source to pay for that, or if you're doing teaching in the summer. At the medical school where I was, you were typically a 12-month employee, and there was an implicit expectation that you were bringing in sufficient funds to continue to cover some benchmark of your salary for the entire year, right? And that was changing while I was there, and moving from around 50% to around 75%. And my understanding is that in that time frame was becoming pretty typical across many medical schools, that was the type of expectation. So the remainder of the time was to be administrative and teaching. Sometimes actual medical clinicians were getting their teaching time paid explicitly for like every single lecture hour they were giving in whatever med school class, whereas the PhD type faculty, there was not as clear a one-to-one exchange for the effort that you're putting into teaching. And that comes down to a topic that's later on this list about hard versus soft money. Hard money is basically there is a budget, there is a line for your 9-month salary, and regardless of what you do, you're going to get paid that. And there might be an expectation that, if you're not regularly meeting whatever benchmark for funding to cover your salary, that you will have to take on more teaching duties or something, to kind of earn your keep. But a soft money position means if there is not grant money to pay that position, you no longer have a job. And so, there are positions at both types of institutions that are explicitly soft money. You have hired some staff person on your grant, and when the grant ends, that job doesn't exist anymore. That's a soft money position. But my experience at medical schools was that even a tenure track faculty position that might be hard money in name was in practice sort of a soft money position, because you were going to have to like apply for internal bridge funds to make up your salary if you didn't in that specific year make enough money to cover your salary. So whatever your position is in whatever kind of institution, really understanding what the expectations are and what the timeline is for bringing in that money to cover your salary is, I think, really, really important. So you really understand what you're earning and how much of that money is guaranteed and how much of that money is kind of a bonus if you are performing and bringing in research money, especially in today's landscape where the research dollars are not as easy to come by.
Awesome. I want to make sure we have enough time to get some big questions answered. So, Danny, I'm going to move to you next, I
Yeah,
believe.
perfect.
I'm switching your question, but can we go with how much
Sure.
dollar amounts?
Okay, yeah. This is a big question, you're right. We're curious if folks could ballpark some of the dollar amounts that are needed to fund your lab. So when we're talking about like how much you're actually making, how much is coming in from these grants, if I need a $10,000, but I'm expecting these indirect values. I'm wondering, and we have kind of a diverse list of panelists that can maybe about at the different institutions, but things like equipment and supplies, things like students, trainees, and staff, things like overhead or things to just keep the lab running on top of, and then also research expenditures as well. So let's start with Chris, but I imagine everybody might have a different ballpark estimate here.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's going to vary highly across institutions and at different stages, as well as so. Yeah, just looking at my own. Well, here's some ballpark, and then we can kind of get into the weeds. So, I would imagine the startup package for somebody in our disciplines to start building your lab is in a range probably the low end 300,000 to the high end of like 1.2 million, depending upon what college you're in and the type of scholarship that you're doing, which means the type of equipment that you may need to buy or the in-kind activities, as Kate said, to buy. If you're a 9-month faculty member, your first priority in some respects is selfishly is to pay your summer salary. And so you would think that you'd have to have enough direct funding on an annual basis to cover 30%, 33%, depending on the college and what they count as your summer rates to do that. With respect to funding the staff in your lab, and the staff, I mean postdocs and students, trainees, that really is going to depend upon your institutional commitment to supporting graduate students. So there were times in my lab, I ran a lab usually um, with 1 to 3 postdocs, um, 3 to 5 PhD students, and 20 undergrads. And so there were times when all of the graduate students were funded by my department, and there was no cost to me to have them in the lab. There were times when I had to fund every graduate student and every postdoc from my external funds. And so you kind of have that wave of stress of trying to figure out how you're paying the bills to keep everybody up and running and working. If you look at, Katie mentioned expenditures. I mean, I think that in biomedical engineering, and our panelists can correct this from their personal experiences, but a top 10 program is probably in the $500,000 a year in expenditures, which means 2 R01s or an R01 and an NSF grant to keep a highly productive, well-staffed lab running. Now, what I've always argued is that I always viewed it like from a strategy perspective, as I always wanted to have as little cost to me and as much cost to the department. And so it helps you float those rainy days better if somebody else is footing the bill. You have a lot more autonomy if you have enough external funded dollars coming in to allow you to have flexibility to do what you want to do. But there's definitely strategies on how do you keep the lab funded.
In terms of costs, I would also encourage you to be really clear on how your institution charges for students. At our institution, we're at a state university, and our State tuition is really pretty low. And so our graduate students, we pay straight tuition, the in-state rate, but it's not very high to begin with. So a graduate student who might make, 36,000 plus health insurance plus tuition is $60,000 a year on a grant, plus overhead, right? Plus F&A or indirects. But at another institution, a private institution with higher tuition, that might look different, or they may have some sort of what's the word I'm looking for? A bargain. That's not the word I'm looking for. Some sort of like tuition forgiveness or remission that you only have to pay some portion of a student's tuition if it's on a grant and the rest of it is forgiven. And we basically have that here for international students, that we essentially, to a high level, we more or less pay the in-state rate for an international student for a certain number of years. So, knowing how exactly you're getting charged changes the cost of a student substantially. And that's going to look really different in different places. Similarly, when you're thinking about how much you will make and you say, oh, I'm going to pay my summer salary, there are often limitations on how much of your summer salary you're allowed to put on a grant, because if you're charging it to the grant, you're working on that grant. So if you are writing another grant, or you are preparing your class for the fall, or you're going on vacation, you absolutely positively cannot put that on a grant. So at my institution, you are not allowed to charge more than 90% of your summer salary in any given pay period to a grant without practically provost approval, to ensure that we're not risking the university or ourselves by violating, so we're never going to get 12 months. On the other hand, we don't get vacation and we just take it. So there's a trade-off.
That was such good information. We're speaking a lot to funding of personnel. And as just an example, in our department, we actually don't have teaching assistantships. We don't have department level GRA positions. And so we are fully responsible for any trainee. That is the expectation. That will not change. Kate's cost of $60K per PhD student is what I came up with. So it's really great. She's right down the street. That we're in equity. Their postdoc, I came up with a number of just over 75,000, 76,000 or so on a postdoc.
That's what I have too. Yeah.
All in. And that's based on the new NIH standard rates, which are increasing now, probably next month, a little bit. There were a lot of expenses I wasn't prepared for, and you need to budget for. Obviously, materials and supply costs. I put a number down here of about $10,000. That tends to be what makes it into projects. We in the motion capture and biomechanics business, if you're doing traditional biomechanics work, you don't have a ton of materials and supply costs generally. Travel, something you need to really consider. Are you going to, I have 4 postdocs and 4 PhD students, about 20 undergraduates as well. I want to send them to conferences. That's why we're here, to build their professional networks, to provide them with the best professional experiences. And conference travel is expensive. And every year I find myself with a complex puzzle, the picture of which is never going to be clear, trying to pull together funds from various places to support that. And then something that's been surprising, and this comes into a question, a vocab question about discretionary versus non-discretionary funding. I am also responsible for all of my students' fees that cannot come from federal grants. I'm also responsible for stipend supplements because F-31s don't pay our institutional minimum. And so I need to come up with $4,000 annually to supplement those. And those can't come from other grants. The F-31 is supporting 100% of that person's time. And so there's all of this stuff that accumulates year after year that is non-negligible. And you need that rainy day fund in the back. Where does that come from? I wrote down a few sources of ours. Promotion and tenure. Brooke good luck. I'm sure it's going to go very well. Promotion and tenure at some institutions will come with a small financial stipend, an account that you can maybe pull from. Teaching and research awards. Sometimes those will come with financial incentives, and I've used those often to support some of these things. And I'm forgetting others, but it is something important to keep in mind. I'll pause there.
I want to jump in because this is a lot of great information and go back to a vocab word, which was one of the reasons we have indirect costs is you are not alone. You have grant management support, you have accounting support, and you should use it. You're going to have to learn all of these things. I'll just add a couple more numbers, and I think they're in the same ballpark of what other people have shared. But one preface here, and this is where, again, you really got to focus on terminology. When we are thinking about running a lab at steady state, for me, we're thinking in terms of total costs. If you're thinking in terms of your startup, you might be thinking more in terms of direct costs. So I guess everything I'm going to share right now is in terms of total costs at steady state. When I think about running a lab or this kind of mini startup, what does it cost? I also included undergrad students. If they're doing things for credit, they might be, $0 anywhere up to maybe $5,000 or $10,000 a year if you're paying them hourly or paying them for a summer. Grad students, total costs, that's all in. That means stipend, health coverage, any of these indirect costs that are associated, tuition, all in for a graduate student is probably somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 a year, depending on your institution. I didn't run the numbers for postdocs, but I'd say probably $70,000 to $120,000 a year. Again, all in. This is not just the stipend. This is the cost of their fringe benefits, their health care, and these indirect costs that are associated with paying them. And then for staff members, so I have staff scientists or staff engineers. I would say total cost is anywhere from $80,000 to $250,000 per year per individual, depending on their experience and level. In general, personnel are going to be your main costs at steady state. Of course, it's different for a startup because you're going to be asking for maybe expensive equipment that you need to get going. But those are the numbers I had down. Personnel is expensive. As other people said, supplies just depends. If you're running a lab that has all the major equipment and computers and you're just collecting data and processing it, you might only spend $5,000 to $10,000 a year in smaller equipment and supplies. But if you're doing engineering, if you're doing a lot of robotics development, you might spend $50,000 or $100,000 a year. So that varies depending on the type of work you're doing. And there were some other good categories called out, like travel, that you have to account for. So personnel expenses are high, and make sure you understand that the salary or the stipend is not the cost to you as the PI. It's the total cost, and there's a lot more that goes into that. But again, if you're at the stage where you're preparing a startup package, you have to be a little bit of a different mindset. You can either ignore the indirect costs, or you can recognize that the university and institution are subsidizing those. I think that's a bit of a different discussion in planning, but I would create a detailed spreadsheet, get examples, and list out absolutely everything as you need for a startup, not just the equipment, but the furniture, space renovations, personnel, and just make sure that's all accounted for so you're setting yourself up for success.
Just want to jump in real quick, just to address what labs can look like at teaching institutions. Excuse me. So for me, I would say my startup package was about $100K. And I have a motion capture lab. So when I was coming up with my startup budget, one thing I would say is I know we talked about talking to your colleagues at other institutions, and other institutions may do things differently. So you might want to talk to your colleagues in your department as well. So my colleague who was hired 2 years before me basically just gave me his spreadsheet. And also when I was negotiating my salary, he made sure that it was the same amount that they offered him. And then he was asked for more. So make sure that you are relying on your department colleagues. So for me, what I did, I knew that I needed force plates and I wanted cameras. So I kind of made my budget with the higher end things, knowing that they weren't going to give me that full amount of money. So like I put in like how much would it be for like, 9 Vicon cameras? I think for what I needed for force plates, they were pretty comparable in price. I ended up getting OptiTrack, which is like still good. Like it may not necessarily be the gold standard, but it's still good and still allows me to get what I need done. So when you're setting up your startup, that was just one thing that I wanted to kind of put out there. Like you can kind of ballpark things, start with some of those more higher end pieces of equipment, but also have, like the mid range or so that's still going to get you good data. Because you may not get everything that you want, or it's just another way for you to be strategic. And again, the 100K is on the higher end. For me and my department, my department is just engineering, so we're all broad in terms of our background from civil, electrical, biomedical, mechanical. So it also depends on the type of research that we're doing. Compared to like kinesiology, their startup is way less than that. So sometimes what people will do is they'll team up with people in other labs. Like I'm actually moving into a collaborative lab space with some of the kinesiology profs so that we can kind of have this interdisciplinary biomechanics space for teaching as well as research. In terms of students, like I said, we pretty much do the bulk of our research in the summer, and we only have undergrads. We pay them an hourly rate based on their year of level of experience. So that can be anywhere between about like 5,300 to about 6,500, depending on the year and level of experience of the student. And included in that is like their FICA, like payroll, taxes. During the academic year, if I do have funding, then I can pay students an hourly rate and I don't have to worry about those additional taxes. And it just depends on like how much budget I have. If I don't have funding, then students can do research for credit, but that's like 3 hours a week. And I know a lot of you are like 3 hours, like that's nothing. But again, at a teaching institution where you're primarily like I teach 3 courses a semester. So where I'm doing a lot of teaching, and then the students are in classes, sports, and all of that, like 3 hours, like sometimes that's just gold to just keep things moving forward. So in terms of like, what you need in terms of startup, that again, going to depend on the type of research that you're doing and also the type of department that you're going into. Again, funding for students, I mostly have undergrads. Some people have postbacks, which I think they pay according to like NIH scales. And then there is an occasional postdoc, but super, super rare at our institution. So just wanted to just kind of shed some insight on like how it can be different at smaller institutions.
I want to just highlight a few things that Brooke said because I think they're really important for all of us to consider. And so, one is as we're trying to extend our money, right? There's ways to do that. So, in the teaching space, if your laboratory is being used for teaching as well, right? So for many of us, we'll have biomechanics labs, might be teaching a biomechanics class, there might be a lab component, and your department might not have a motion capture system that's only used for education. Depending upon the institution and your policies and procedures, you may be able to charge lab fees for your equipment, to use your equipment. And then that money can come back into your lab to help on those day-to-day expenses. It also can help go into a kind of a rainy day fund. So, we get a great startup package, but then 10 years later, your motion capture system is, 10 years old, right? And it's not the newest and the greatest. And so starting to have some money put aside for that eventual replacement, not that necessarily you as the PI would have to go out and buy another motion capture system yourself, but it's something you can bring to the table and say to your department chair, hey, our equipment's no longer competitive. I've got 20 grand that I can put towards that 80 grand equipment that I've, put aside over the years. The second observation is the undergraduate research students in the lab. For us, I would always have a minimum of them signing up for full. We had 0 to 3 credits in the lab, and 0 credits was 3 hours a week, and 3 credits was 9 hours a week. And so you can provide really sound educational experiences to those students and essentially have a 40-hour staff person that's paid for free by tuition. And so at most of our institutions, if you go to a really good, if you go to an institution that's going to have engineering or going to have a good kinesiology program, you're going to have really good undergraduates. And I've had undergraduates start in the lab as freshmen and are doing close to PhD quality work when they're seniors because they've been in the lab for 4 straight years. And so I can't underemphasize both the altruistic reward of working with undergrads a lot in the lab, as well as you're getting really good students that can really, really support the scholarship in your lab that way. So thanks for sharing that, Brooke.
Yeah, I would like to jump in with a couple of things. One is also to emphasize something that Brooke had in there, and to say this very explicitly. And if I personally, for one lab, am asking for, I don't know, a $200,000 piece of equipment, the university is going to look at it one way. But if there are other labs or other faculty members that could also benefit from it, and we are asking, right? If you're thinking about your startup package, you can ask for more if you can position it as equipment that is legitimately going to benefit other faculty in the department. So keep that in mind, that it's a negotiation, and part of the negotiation is finding ways you can leverage your asks to align with other things. I'm really big on alignment. So that's kind of one pro tip if you're trying to ask for more is make it for more than just you. And then the other one that I kind of wanted to say explicitly, because I think, especially with all this discussion of money, don't lose track of time. Time is one of your most important assets, and there can be a tendency, and I know, especially coming out of grad school or postdocs, you're looking for ways to save money, and sometimes that actually works against you. So if you get a startup package, if you have funds for equipment or personnel, you want to put them to use. You want to get your research program going. And to give a specific example, one of the things I discovered when I was starting as a faculty member is there are certain pieces of major research equipment that are well known to have very long lead times. Okay? 6 months, a year. And you don't want to show up and then place your order and have to wait a year, because when you really stop and think about it, that your time cost, your personnel's time cost, you're spending more money wasting time because you can't get your research started. So keep time in mind. There are times where you don't actually want to negotiate, let's say, with vendors on the lowest price, but you want to negotiate to make sure they deliver your equipment by a set amount of time. When I set up my lab, I actually negotiated with vendors to hit a specific delivery date. And in our written negotiation was, I will pay less for your equipment if you miss that date. Right? Like that was I'm not trying to get the best deal. I need this here when I start because we have to get going. So yes, research is expensive. Yes, personnel are expensive. I think Jason put in the comments, like, you're going to be supported. You're going to ask for the funds and the resources you need to be successful. But don't lose track of the fact that you are building something from the ground up, and you got to get going. You got to spend those funds. You got to be willing to take some risks and be aggressive. And the university wants that. They're investing in you for a reason. So just don't lose track of that. And all this discussion of funding, don't think that you have to pull back and always be conservative. You got to be strategic, but you got to push sometimes too, and know what you're pushing towards.
And just to piggyback off of what Carl said about being strategic, and I think maybe it was Jason who mentioned this, about some of the awards that you can get institutionally that come with funding. One thing that I would encourage you all, if you're on the market, see if it's possible for you to get like a pre-tenure sabbatical, because that can free you up to get some research done as well. So at my institution, in your 3rd year, if you are pre-tenure, you can apply for an award. You just kind of like lay out your vision, like what you've done so far and what where you see yourself going research wise, and how it benefits the students and the institution. And that comes with a pre-tenure sabbatical for 1 semester. And you get to pick which semester in your 4th year that you want to do this. So it's just another way to, be productive. So I remember when I was on the market, actually, my dean, my dean when I joined, he was the one that told me about that. See if you can get a pre-tenure sabbatical. And it also came with, since we do a lot of teaching, that came with an award, a financial award to the department to hire an adjunct to cover the classes that I wouldn't be able to teach that semester. And again, if you have some larger funding sources, you might be able to just buy yourself out that other semester, and then essentially you have like a year where you're on sabbatical and you can, pretty much focus on your research. So again, just especially for those going to teaching institutions, right, there are ways that you can still move your research forward, even if you don't have a lot of research time, but just some things to think about. I don't know what that looks like at some of the R1. So that's why I wanted to throw that out there in case some of the other panelists have different experiences with these.
I dropped it in the chat. It's very specific to different departments, different colleges. The college through which my tenure home is offers that same thing: 1 semester teaching release, pre-tenure sabbatical in the 3rd, 4th year. For us, again, I'm just reading my own chat, but if you didn't see it or can't see it, it's encouraged to use that time to get out in front of potential letter writers for your P&T package, so that you can get your research, go to seminars, become known to your colleagues. You get that national reputation.
All right, I want to thank all our panelists for answering the moderated questions, and now move into the audience Q&A portion of this. We got about 20 minutes left here. If there are audience questions, feel free to unmute and ask. I'm going to look through the chat and see what hasn't been answered, and then we can fill in the gaps there.
While you're looking, I just want to really emphasize what Jason said, or bring it up again, with respect to these numbers can sound scary, and it seems like there's a lot of stress involved in financially keeping the lab and the research going. But I just, it's a team effort. The university is there to support you. Your mentors are there to support you. There's not a better job in the world than being a faculty member, in my opinion. To have the ability to work with an incoming crop of students and postdocs and staff scientists on a regular basis, and to answer questions that we find to be valuable, and the independence that comes with the work that we do is just, and then the beneficial work that our work has on society. I think in biomechanics, we're uniquely positioned to impact the world, and we get to do that on a daily basis. And so, the business side of it is one of the things you trade off for having the best job in the world.
And also to reiterate that there's a runway here. You're not spending all of this and needing all of this money in year 1. You've got time to build up to it, to grow your lab. You're not going to have 5 grad students and 3 postdocs, maybe ever, like, if you don't want to. You also have a lot of control over what your scope is and how many people you bring in. And just another note of less anxiety.
That's such a good point. And it's really important that we underline it, which is, when we're chairing search committees, talking to faculty that might join our department, we're asking, how big of a lab do you see yourself having? Because you have a lot of freedom and flexibility. You have a lot of agency on making those decisions. And you could be very successful, even at an R01, by defining the scope of the work you want to do, and then securing enough funding to do that. You get to define what success looks like for you. You need not be chasing what success looks like for other people. And you have to go into it like that, because if you if you don't make intentional decisions, you can find yourself with a lab that's larger than you wanted, and then additional expectations to continue to support the size of the lab that you've now acquired. And so, oftentimes we may not be in a position to make those decisions at all times, but to the extent we can, yeah, define your own success, fit in leaving to go home to go play basketball, fit in going out and exercising or spending time with friends or reading, fit that into your definition of success, figure out how much funding that definition needs, and then just do good science.
Right. Any audience questions from the people here? I have one in the chat, but I want to give space for people to ask their own questions if they have them.
So I'll ask one question because I think it might be a little long to type out. I'm just kind of curious. So when, you're starting a lab and in the initial years, you really want to get some funding momentum going, grow the lab, get people in that can start doing the research, but also kind of, maybe apply to a job with some new ideas that are a little bit more outside your comfort zone or splitting off from kind of your core background experience. How did you guys kind of decide to balance the risk reward, safer ideas, more ambitious ideas in the early years of the lab when funding pressure might have been a little bit higher?
So I'll throw out some thing to think about. I always felt like I needed to have low risk. I need to have a portfolio, right? And so some of it is low risk. I hate to say it this way, least publishable unit, right? Everything that we did in the lab had to be of a scholarship level that I felt could be published in high quality biomechanics journals. But I knew that I wanted to have a continual pipeline of research that I controlled. It didn't require extra people. It didn't require extra equipment. It didn't require funding. That again, ask good questions and the like. Then I had kind of the mid-range, high risk, high reward, and then I had we need to do this pilot data. If we get this done, then we can get an R1. If we don't get it, like I watch a lot of people who were kind of putting all their eggs in the collecting pilot data and then just hitting 4 cycles of NIH funding with more pilot data. And then 3 years into it, they had no publications because they were just collecting pilot data. I've had people who did that approach and they hit 3 R01s and they didn't publish anything, but 5 papers in their pre-tenure year, but they had 3 R01s when they went up for tenure. So you have to find what works for you. But my approach again was to have some low-lying fruit, some mid-lies, and then some reaches. I do think that as you're building your lab and bringing on students, you can get into trouble if you let students do their own thing, right? So you need to have a central line of research that they can step, one side to the left or one side to the right, but you can't have somebody doing sports over here, somebody doing ergonomics in the lab, somebody doing neuromechanics in the lab, because you just don't have the bandwidth to do that. So my opinion is have a central line and then stay a little bit off of that. When you get tenure or once you have the lab established, then you have much more flexibility to broaden your horizons.
Yeah, I think that's sage advice. That was my experience, and I think that's the advice I would give to people is you need to focus 80 or 90% of your effort on your core competency. You're jumping in the deep end. You're now competing for grants and resources with people that have been in the field for 20, 30, 40 years. And one of the ways you do that is by leveraging your unique background and your niche. My experience is it takes about 5 years, or it's taken me about 5 years to broaden into new areas. That's how long it took me to go from kind of lower limb biomechanics researcher to getting into kind of exoskeletons and ergonomics. And then it took another 5 years to get into wearable sensors. And it was by spending small amounts of time to kind of build those portfolios on the side. But as a as I describe my own career, like my first 5 years at Vanderbilt were focused on lower limb prosthetics and walking biomechanics because that's what I did in grad school and that's what I did in a postdoc and that's what I had to offer. And that's how I competed successfully for external grant funding. So my advice would be know your core competency. I think keeping your lab aligned, because in addition to your research, all the things we're talking about, setting up your lab organizationally, setting up your culture, setting up the structure takes a lot of time and effort. But and I do encourage people to have those exploratory projects, but half a day a week maybe is kind of about right, or you're leveraging some undergrads to start to explore into some areas. But my advice would be stay focused. It's going to take some time, not just to get the pilot data, but to secure grants. It's a 1.5 to 3.5, 4 year process often to go from early ideas to actually getting the funding. So kind of plan accordingly.
I'd also say it from like a branding point of view. When you think about what's going to happen when somebody's reading your application or when you're going up for tenure, people want and need to be able to say, so and so is an expert in X. And it needs to be, fit in a sentence so that you have that competency that they can talk to about how the work that you've done supports that you have established yourself as an expert in X. And if you have too many things that are too far afield, it's harder to have that through line for them to point to say they're an expert in X, right? So, I think of it from personal branding too.
I want to get to Miss Jackie. She also has a question here. Go ahead.
Some of you know I'm looking at all this with over 60 years of hindsight. So, and all schools now are starting to get undergraduates more involved in research very early. So I would just encourage everybody here to start integrating this type of financial analysis considerations into the educational process with the students as soon as they start research. Because one of the first things we all learn in our work careers is that no matter what your profession is, you better learn how to follow the money.
Yeah, there's a sage advice there. I think that the two things that I try to hold together at all times, right, is what Jason said, and then to kind of the last couple comments, which is there's a game to play, figure out a way to play it in a way that aligns with your values and what you define, how you define success. You have there's strategy to all of this, right? Like there's strategic decisions that you can make, and the earlier you start becoming aware of them, and the earlier we can train students this side of it, but never lose track of you have to look yourself in the mirror and be proud of what you're doing.
Stop the recording in case there are any personal questions that people want to ask as we wrap up here. So thank you all for joining for the recorded part. And last step is some personal questions for the outro.